So thank you guys all for being here at our workshop / lecture Venture Capital 101 Fundraising for Young Founders. We are well aware, being young ourselves, that venture capital space is not as inclusive as it should be, and has quite high barriers to entry. So we hope after this this workshop that you guys feel as if we lowered those barriers a little bit. Don't hesitate to ask any questions, to correct us if we make a mistake, because we've only been working in the space for 2 months now. Thank you guys for being here. And then Lena will shortly introduce our organization, ASIF, that we work for, and why we are here also.
Yes. So ASIF Ventures is a venture capital fund. If you don't know what a venture capital fund is, no worries. At the end of this presentation or workshop, you hopefully will, which supports students and recent graduates in basically their founding process, specifically by giving access to funding. First I want to explain what we mean by recent graduates. So recent graduates is within 3 years of graduation, which is for bachelor, master, as well as PhD students. So we have quite a broad range of young founders we can work with, and from across any university, any space in Amsterdam metropolitan region. We aren't limited in any way in our investment criteria, except that the company needs to be based within Amsterdam, so to say. And we can offer 3 things, which is funding, a community, and a network. To elaborate a bit more on the funding, so we have 2 different funds. One is a fund that is funded by the UvA and the VU, and there we can invest a first round of 25,000 euros into a startup. Many of the startups we invest into are very early stage startups. We're really the very earliest venture capital funding you could find. And most companies are pre-revenue. Often they don't have a minimal viable product, which is like the easiest version of their product that they could put into the market. So very, very special venture capital fund, I would say. And then when a company hits certain milestones and develops quite well with the first investment, we can also follow up with a second round from the private fund, which is a fund of different angel investors, which will also explain what that means in case you don't know, in second round. And what we offer apart from funding is also, I would say, access to social capital. So on the one hand, we really try to foster a community of young entrepreneurs, and through our community work also really aim to inspire new demographics to become entrepreneurs, because I think traditionally speaking, different entrepreneurial spaces tend to be very white and very male dominated, or cis male dominated, and also very privileged from a socioeconomic perspective. And we also offer access to our network of other venture capital funds, because we work very closely with other VCs here in the Netherlands, as well as industry experts and other investors. For first-time founders, it's often quite hard to have access to all the social capital that you also need in your entrepreneurial journey. And ASIF is really a place that tries to accumulate that in many ways. Kira, did I miss something?
No, I don't think so. Maybe that we're in total a 1 million euro fund. Half of this 1 million comes from the University of Amsterdam and the VU, and the other half comes from the market. So we're able to combine both market insights from experienced investors, as well as academic insights. But we're currently also working more closely together with the HVA, and we're luckily invited here to speak amongst other very interesting companies and institutions. I think with regards to our organization, we touched upon most things. And I also wanted to...
Last thing, sorry, that's important to mention, because I think we assume that. So ASIF every year is led by a board of 5 recent graduates, so young people like ourselves who just graduated. And it's also really a learning experience for ourselves of how to run a venture capital fund, which is, of course, really, really challenging, but also less challenging than you would think, I think, in some ways. But that's also very special, because therefore we have a very strong foothold in the student community, because we were just students ourselves a few months ago.
Yeah, and I will shortly introduce myself and shortly touch upon how I ended up working in the space of venture capital, I guess. So I was born and raised in Groningen. I worked for a startup there when it was still a startup, Belsimple, which probably is a company that most of you guys know. Then I moved to Berlin, where I also worked for a startup that was very successful at the time, raised a lot of money, but imploded under the pressure created by venture capital, which is also something that we will discuss more later. After living in Berlin, I moved to Amsterdam, where I studied philosophy, politics, and economics, where I also met Lena, actually, and where I really missed the hands-on approach because it's very international relations and policy making focused. And I've always had a love for entrepreneurship, and especially for certain sectors that are listed on the slide, such as vertical farming, water and waste management, and sustainable energy, because I believe that if you're able to innovate in those sectors as an entrepreneur, you can make a great impact. So I hope to be an entrepreneur myself within those spaces in the future. At ASIF currently, I'm an operations and finance director, so I make sure that we operate within the legal framework. Also do accounting, so I oversee quite a lot of the dry aspects of the organization, but I'm also involved in portfolio management, which is the aspect of the company that looks how we guide our startups that we've invested in, which is very interesting to professionalize those things. And what I said earlier, I think VC is a space that is very interesting because we're such a key stakeholder in financing innovation. And of course, it's called venture or durfkapitaal in Dutch. And it should be one of the most risk-taking forms of capital, especially in relation to, I think, normal banks, who often tend to be a brake on innovation. So that makes it very interesting that we spur innovation in that sense, but we're sometimes less risk-taking than we pretend or aim to be, but more upon that later, and also the flaws of venture capital financing. I will pass the ball on to Lena.
Thank you. So yeah, my name is Lena. I'm originally from Berlin, from Germany, but moved to the Netherlands to also study philosophy, politics, and economics. So Kira and I, like she said, studied together. Yeah, during my time in PPE, I worked with an organization called Gross 20, and Gross 20 basically brings young women into the G20 to assist with policy on the labor inclusion of young women. And I think that's where I initially got really interested in diversity and inclusion issues and being an advocate for gender diversity within tech and the economy as such. I also founded Youth Act, which is basically kind of like a social accelerator for impact entrepreneurs and people interested in advocacy and activism. So maybe also something interesting to look at for some of you. But right now, I work at ASIF Ventures as well as the Community and Inclusion Director. And within my role, I focus on creating different opportunities for young founders through our events and different learning opportunities we provide. But I also focus a lot on increasing opportunities for female and minority founders. With Youth Act, I actually ran a consultancy project for ASIF Ventures on this topic in February of 2020. And that's why I was asked to then take on this role. And it's quite funny because when you're a consultant consulting on an issue, you never think that you will be implementing your own recommendations, but that's in a way what I'm doing now. But mostly, I've been doing a lot of research these 2 months to understand what kind of initiatives already exist in the space. It's quite a hot topic, but I think many of the things happening are more of a PR stunt, sadly, than anything else. So that's what I'm currently doing in my role. But more on that later as well.
So before we are diving more in depth with regards to VC, I quickly want to outline the goals of this session. So we want to start with an understanding of the basics of VC terminology, because there's a lot of acronyms, a lot of jargon involved in this sector, which also higher the barrier to entry. So we hope to break down that barrier in that sense, that you know some of these terms before, so that you can actually understand the sector and what they're talking about. Because I think as many sort of more elitist sectors do, use of jargon is also to keep it less inclusive. So we hope to break down those barriers. Then secondly, we want to discuss when and how to approach VCs for funding, because a lot of starting entrepreneurs, I think, don't know that there's benefits and cons of taking certain forms of financing, and VCs is really only suitable for certain types of startups and for certain types of founders, and there are a lot of other great alternatives, and VC money can also bring you a lot. So we do want to touch upon all of that. And lastly, when we've walked through the pros and cons of VC funding, we want you to feel more confident and strategic when asking for financial resources. So we want to outline some more concrete tips and tricks when you go into a conversation where you have to raise funds.
And we'd like to keep this session quite interactive. So if you have any questions, feel free to write into the chat or even unmute yourself and just jump in. And we'll also be asking you a few questions throughout the way to just see what you already know. And maybe we can also learn something from you, because like we said, we're not necessarily experts in the field per se. So yeah, get ready to jump in if you're down for that. But yeah, as I told you, so I also founded something. It's not a startup, but it's a foundation called Youth Act. And even though, yeah, I have different experiences, let's say, with fundraising than maybe a typical startup founder would have, I've still gone through some of these ups and downs. And I'd like to share them with you today, which is, I think often when you start something and you found something, you really think you have such a great idea and that there will be a lot of people who will help you. And you think that all you need is truly just some love. But then I think throughout my journey as a young founder, and maybe you will experience the same in the future, you realize at some point, well, sadly, you also need funding. And yeah, Kira and I made this small graph here on the right, which is kind of there to indicate how we feel about different sources of funding. So we both feel extremely comfortable with finding money on the floor, even if it's maybe a bit immoral to take it. Yeah, donations also still feel great. Grants and subsidies are already quite complicated and intimidating. I find corporate sponsorship, yeah, scary, difficult topic. But then when it comes to angels and VC funding, yeah, as you can see, it's bright red, because I think, at least from my perspective as a young founder with Youth Act, something that I would probably never have tapped into because it seems too intimidating for me personally. However, yeah, as we said, throughout this session, we want to move away from the dark red and move it towards the yellow or maybe even the green, and make sure that you feel comfortable in approaching VCs for funding.
So to break down the initial barriers, we want to talk you guys through VC terminology. Yeah, because we make use of a lot of acronyms and jargon. So the first question would be whether you guys know any of these words actually, and whether you would be willing to explain them to the group. Is there anybody that knows the term, for example, hockey stick growth, and that can quickly give a definition of that?
Hi. Well, lastly, we had a workshop also given by Bart, and he explained that the hockey stick was more like when a business is starting, they will make costs first, which will drop the chart, and then later on they will start earning money, and that will make it go up, which makes the form of a hockey stick. I think this is like
yeah, I would say that is 100% correct. And a hockey stick growth curve is something that a lot of investors, but especially VCs, really like to see, because yeah, the whole industry is almost built upon this notion that companies are able to scale immensely in a relatively short time period. So what venture capitalists tend to go for is that from the mode of investments, they would like to see an exit happening, and an exit is either your company is offered on the stock market, or there's an acquisition happening within 10 years, preferably around 6-7 years. So in that time, they want to see a probably best case scenario vertical growth, if that would be possible. And with that also comes scalability. I don't know, Nikki, if you guys talked about scalability as well. Because scalability, how we always explain it, is that a company is scalable if you can serve one customer with one employee, and also serve 100 customers with 2 employees. So you're not very reliant on human capital in that sense. So consultancy business is almost per definition not scalable, because you need a big amount of consultants to serve a big market. But an e-commerce platform, of course, is very scalable.
Cool, which takes us to the next acronym, which is the MVP. Does anyone happen to know what an MVP is and would like to give a brief definition? I'll count down 3, 2, 1. Okay, then I'll go. So basically, yeah, an MVP is a minimal viable product, which some of you might know. But basically the idea is that you create the easiest version of your product and you put it into the market to test whether there is indeed a market need and to kind of understand how the market responds to it. So the goal would be to validate the product in the market. And when the product is not validated for whatever reason, you could pivot, which basically means that you can change either the product itself or how your business model functions or how you enter the markets. You can just change basically anything that you're doing until you finally find this point of validation where you find that market need and you also find the right solution to the problem in a way. And when that happens, when the solution and the problem really overlap, and the customer realizes that you're solving the problem and is willing to buy or spend money to acquire your product, then you have the product market fit where you can basically also build something at the same rate at which the customer or the consumer would consume it. And another really important word that partly relates to this as well is intellectual property. The acronym is IP. Where basically, an VC might ask you whether you actually own the rights to your innovation or to your product, which most VCs will ask you sooner or later in conversations.
Yeah, and a word that is very related to a minimum viable product is the lean startup method, which people tend to hear about. Is there anybody here that heard about the lean startup methods and the way in which it operates? And that feels like explaining it, maybe?
Please.
So I will also count down 3, 2, 1. So I think most of you guys probably heard about the lean startup method. It's very similar to or related to the minimum viable product, where you would really take the core product, so this minimum viable product, put it out to the market, see how people respond to that, then pivot, change your product, so then you can grow your company and validate your company without using a lot of financial resources. Not about not using a lot of financial resources. That is also what the word bootstrapping is all about. It's pretty much as a company being completely reliant on your own funding and the own revenue that you generate, and not rely on external funding, which a lot of companies do. And then you can really grow your company very naturally without going in depth or without being reliant on external parties. Another few words that are important, Lena and I believe, are our value proposition. And I think if you guys are ever building a company or any idea, it's very important that you know who are your stakeholders and what sort of value do you generate for those different stakeholders, as well as what is the competitive advantage of your product, which is, I think, a term that you guys are probably also familiar with. How do you differentiate yourselves from the rest, and what aspects of your company make that you are able to differentiate yourselves from the rest? And then a pitch deck, which is often like around 10-slide summary of your company, of your team, that you send out to potential investors or potential parties that you can collaborate with, that states what your company is doing, how it is functioning, what sort of revenue you are generating, and what sort of funds you are seeking. So if you guys ever have to set up a pitch deck or need help or feedback on a pitch deck, don't hesitate to contact us, because we would be happy to look at it and to give some tips, because we see around 300 to 400 pitch decks a year. So we have a little bit of a feeling for what works and what doesn't work.
Cool. Then 2 more important words are incubators and accelerators, which I'm guessing probably most of you know as well. But they're basically different programs to either accelerate the development of the entrepreneur themselves, or to basically work on the startup idea. And in the Netherlands, there are a lot of different incubator and accelerator programs. For example, ACE here in here in Amsterdam, which are really supportive of young first-time founders, and I think it can be a great opportunity, especially if you don't have so much experience with entrepreneurship yet. Other important words in the realm of marketing are, of course, the target market and traction. I think if you ever approach a VC, they will always ask you, who is your target market? So what group of customers are you really trying to target? And also, how will that target market change over time as you scale and as you grow your company? And also, the second thing that will 100% be asked is what your current traction is, which is, of course, more important if you already have a minimal viable product or something that you've put into the market. But basically, VC will always want to know how the market is responding, what kind of evidence or data there is to show that people are interested in your product.
Yeah, and traction can happen in loads of different forms. That can be different customers that are interested in your product, already other businesses that say that they want to partner up with you. So general interest of the public, I would say, in the different sectors. So with regards to analytics, these are a lot of terms I think that you guys would hear if you would enter a conversation with a potential investor. So most of the words here are all KPIs, key performance indicators. So those are all like quantifiable measures of how you are performing. So the burn is the burn rate. How quick are you burning through your money? How much money do you have to spend for your company to stay alive? Churn is a word that indicates the amount of customers that stop using your product in a certain time frame, mostly every month. Then customer acquisition cost is often something that investors really want to know. How much does it cost you to acquire a new customer? For e-commerce shops, it tends to be relatively expensive because Google ads and Facebook ads are just relatively expensive. And retention, how loyal are your customers?
Cool, which takes us to the next slide, which is the slide on finance. So we just briefly wanted to kind of explain the difference between a venture capital fund and an angel. Angels, are basically investors who invest into companies at very early stages. Angels can be wealthy individuals, people who used to be entrepreneurs themselves, who support companies in their earlier stages by making an investment, but also often by offering access to their social capital, so their network or the experience or knowledge they have. VCs are a bit different. Once again, it's important to bear in mind there are also a lot of different kinds of VCs, which we can't go into now because of time limits, but basically it's a fund structure where a lot of either individual angels or bigger public institutions, like for example the universities, come together and invest money into one fund that is then invested into quite high risk tech startups with often the goal of at least tripling the fund. So many of the people who put money into VC will basically put it there because they hope that there will be really high growth aspirations, which is important to know.
And then the two final terms, the term sheet and the cap table. So the cap table is another word for the capitalization table. It just shows who holds what percentage of the company. So probably if you're going to found a company with one of your friends, you would make the division 50-50. So we will have your name 50% and somebody else's name 50%. What is important to note with regards to the cap table is that there are certain percentages that investors want to see are owned by the founding team, but I will talk a little bit more about that later. And the term sheet is just a contract that you and your investor have to agree upon, and it outlines all the conditions involved with the money you're getting. So if we would give you 25K, against what conditions are we giving you 25K? What is the interest rate? How will this 25K be just a loan, or will this convert into shares eventually? This is all discussed in the term sheet. If you guys ever want to discuss these topics because you're working with a startup or on a startup and hear these terms, then again, don't hesitate to contact us. And then startup, we quickly want to define the word startup because it's used everywhere actually. And that might be a good question. How would you guys define startup? You can put it in the chat or you can say it out loud.
So how I would put a startup is you have a certain idea and you make a business plan for it, and then for 5 years it's called a startup. Then after that it's called a scale up, and you try to work that idea out. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Yeah, I think that is for sure a definition, because that's why we also put it in. Startup is defined in many different ways by many different people, and also where the limits are from a startup to a scale up is very, very difficult and almost country dependent because of fund sizes that are invested. And some companies, of course, that exist for more than 5 years are still call themselves a startup, even though they're so big and generating so much money that they maybe wouldn't even be a scale up anymore. But why we define it is because we want to give you guys a definition of a startup from a VC perspective. And the two terms that we discussed earlier, hockey stick growth and scalability, are very much key with regards to that, because for VCs, a startup is a startup when it is able to grow and scale very quickly indeed. So maybe not 5 years, but for sure under the 10 years, they need to be able to address a gigantic market size.
Maybe it's also interesting to think about how that differentiates itself from a small and medium-sized company, because I think for some VCs, you might apply with a certain idea and they might not think that it's a startup because of the lack of scalability and growth. So then they would say, oh, you have a small, medium-sized company idea, which is also great, but maybe doesn't fit the VC criteria. But we would still take that with a grain of salt, because once again, it's how a VC defines a startup, but not necessarily how you personally would define one. But next up, we want to take you through the startup curve, which I guess many of you might have seen as well, but I think it's still interesting to talk about for a number of reasons. Like I said, I founded a foundation. For me, it's the same. So I think many people who try to initiate anything really go through this process. But basically, you have an initial idea, and like Kira would say, you're like on a pink cloud thinking, I have such a great idea, and I'm so sure people will help me. And you also find initial first people to talk to, and they will help you, and they love your idea, and they don't want anything in return except your energy. But then after a while, reality sets in, and you realize it's so hard to build something from scratch, and you might have a really deep low. But then if you can hold up and kind of recover from these lows, you might start experimenting and pivoting. So we discussed before, I think it's very important to be very self-critical of your idea and also willing to change it. And at some point, if you continue doing that, you might realize that your idea starts working. All the way until you reach this like apparently beautiful moment where you finally have the product market fit, which is like the unicorn moment where you're like, wow. And that's when you can start to scale, and when you also become very interesting for many venture capital funds.
Yeah, so we think that the previous curve, emotional roller coaster that comes with building any sort of company, may that be a startup or a small, medium-sized business or an initiative, comes also with different levels of financing. So the previous curve, all that emotional roller coaster happens in the valley of death. That is where, according to the statistics, or almost 99% of the companies end up. Most of the startups don't make it out of there. And in this valley of death, you most of the time get your financing through friends or family that believe in your idea, or through angels, so rich individuals that believe in your idea that want to back you. So you call this seed capital, or I think in the world of today, you call this often pre-seed or pre-seed capital. So companies that indeed have this minimal viable product, maybe a little bit of revenue, a little bit of traction. And once you're performing a little bit better and you have more traction and a little bit more revenue, you hit the break-even point. I think many of the startups in the current format never really hit this break-even point for a multitude of reasons. But in this graph, yes. And once you have more traction and are more interesting for the market, that's when the bigger institutional investors come around the corner, such as VCs. So in your first round of financing, you often go for a pre-seed round, which yeah, in the Netherlands, it's often an amount, I think, I would say around 100 and 150K that you get from investors. And there's a certain amount of time that happens in between financing rounds. So at this first tranche, you have a pre-seed seed round that is around 100K. And then investors expect you to raise your next round often within six to 8 months. Then you move to a Series A round, which tends to be around 1 million in the Netherlands. Often startups have a bridge round in between where they get 600, 700K from angels or other investors. That is something we see currently with our startups. And the funny thing is, in the US, a seed round or a Series A round is, you can add another zero. Then they will talk about 20 million because the startups there have to pay their IT people already 150,000 in salary every single year. And then you can move up to the third tranche where you start entering the Series C and Series D investment. But already this is something you have to question yourself as a founder, because every time you raise funds is every time you are giving shares away to different sort of investors, and you're diluting the own amount that you have in the shares of the company. So what we see a lot with young founders is that friends and family give you 8,000 euros, for example, but they take 20 or 30% of the company because often because they don't know any better. But a lot of institutional investors, such as VC, want you to have at least 75% of the company once you're raising the first pre-seed round. And you need to keep that amount until you're entering Series A, and then they will dilute it to a 50% ownership of the company with the founders. So when you move to the right, and what is the final phase that these investors all like to see is an exit. So an exit can happen in two ways. Either you go to the stock market with your company, or you're acquired by a bigger fish. And a lot of VCs are trying to seek startups that are being sold for 500 million, because those startups need to generate the return that the other 99% didn't generate.
And what's quite, I think, unique about ASIF is that we really still invest in the so-called valley of death, which many other venture capital funds don't do. But we wanted to give you a small insight into our portfolio and selected 2 of our 6 companies that we have invested into in the past, and that we're currently working with very closely to help them secure follow-up funding and strategic decision-making, etc., etc. One of them is Project CC, which is a marketplace for fair and sustainable fashion. These 3 young women are our age, so also in their 20s, and they've already been running the startup since 2 years. And it's just very inspiring and impressive to work with them on a regular basis. Another company that we've invested into is LALA, which is basically an AI-driven company which generates ethnically and body size inclusive human models. The long-term vision or goal is that every single person can have their own avatar, but until then, you will have more body size and ethnically inclusive models. One, to kind of have more representation within the fashion industry, but 2, also because currently so much of the clothing that people order online is returned because it doesn't fit. And they hope to basically create a more sustainable online shopping world by ensuring that you can actually try on the clothing on a model that looks much more like you and also has your body sizes. Also 2 very, very young founders, really inspiring people. But next up, we wanted to take you a bit more into when and how you could approach VCs for funding. And Kira will dive into that.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I worked for a startup in Berlin that was very successful at what they were doing, and they were also raising several millions. But they imploded under the pressure of external investors, and this growth that you need to chase, actually, because VC, of course, it's called venture capital for a reason, and it's very much based on old capitalistic notions that are all very reliant on exponential growth, which at least me and Lena believe from a personal perspective is a relatively outdated framework and also relatively unsustainable, because the thing with venture capital is the moment you take it from an investor, the investor also expects you to raise the next round. So often as a founder, once you get R25K, you have to start raising the next 100, 150K right after. This creates a high pressure environment that is not necessarily super beneficial for all sorts of companies, nor for all sorts of founders. So this is for sure something that you have to take into account, because if you build a company that can be reliant on its own revenue streams to grow, this is for sure something I think that can be very beneficial and more healthy and will give you more ownership of your own company. VC is also very reliant on certain power relations, because investors expect 99% of the companies to die the moment a startup is not doing well. There's no direct incentive to invest a lot of resources in a startup, because you as an investor very quickly believe, okay, this startup is part of the 99%, which gives an unequal relationship. So if you ever enter a relationship with your investor, I think it's very important also that you ask in the first conversation, how did you handle the startups that had a near-death moment, and were you there to back them? So yeah, you really need to know, why are you taking VC money, and is this truly beneficial for you as a founder?
Yeah, and maybe it's also important to add when it is beneficial, which is that, of course, through VC funding, yeah, you can get access to often the social network, once again, of your angel or your venture capital fund, which I think can be extremely helpful if you want to grow a company. If you want to scale quickly, if you have an idea where you think you want to have a very wide impact with that and you want it to grow very, very quickly, then venture capital money is, of course, yeah, a really, really good option. In some ways, you could also say you're diversifying the risks you're taking, because you have other people who take the risk with you, who also have a stake in your company, who want you to succeed. So there are also a lot of benefits, so to say, that come out of it. The only reason why we really wanted to put up this slide is because it's very easy to emphasize all the benefits. We do that all the time, and also in conversations with founders, to kind of explain all the things that we as a venture capital fund can give through our portfolio management, etc. At the same time, especially for young founders, I think it's really important to be aware of these pitfalls and these risks. Yeah, mostly because we don't have experience yet, so people might also be more predatory or more willing to exploit our lack of experience.
Yeah, and as Lena said, there are for sure also a lot of benefits in taking VC money if you set up a certain company. When you're in an extremely competitive sector, for example, if you want to establish a next picnic, you better go after VC funding, because otherwise you won't make a decent shot in the race. Also, what I said, that a lot of the sector is reliant on these old notions like exponential growth and unequal relationships. There is also a lot of VCs that move away from this and that are moving towards impact investment, which I think maybe you guys will talk about in the coming week. Some of these parties are Shift Invest, so that's an early stage VC that is impact focused, where they really invest exclusively in companies that do not only bring monetary returns to their fund, but also make a great environmental impact or social impact. A lot of these impact investment funds rely on the sustainable development goals. This is a map of the tech venture capital ecosystem in the Netherlands. So it also highlights the different sort of VCs that are there and the different sorts of financing. So crowdfunding in the top left corner is an alternative one can for sure look at if you don't want to seek VC money. If you do, it's very much interesting to look into incubators and accelerators, because these are institutions that can help you through your ideation and realization phase and bring your company to the next level. Also at incubators and accelerators, it is interesting to look at the percentages they take of your company, because that is often how their business model works. And one should always ask themselves, is what I'm getting worth what I get in return? And then you move into the different VCs. There's also VCs that specifically focus on founders, female and minority founders, which is very interesting. I think Lena can tell you a little bit more about.
Yeah, so here in the Netherlands, the most prominent example of that is the Borsky Fund. Yeah, then there are also a lot of initiatives like the Next Women, for example, who focus on female founders. I personally think that in the Dutch scene, as compared to, for example, the UK or the US scene, there are far less VCs that explicitly focus on people of color and Black founders, for example. So I'm still searching for that. So if you happen to know any who do, then please write it into the chat. But yeah, I think this is really just to highlight, if you are ever looking for VC funding, there is a lot to choose from, and it's important to know what your own values are and what you want to achieve with the company, and then also select the right source of funding that allows you to realize that. And it's sometimes hard because you need to find out exactly what a VC is like, but it helps often to approach other founders who have been working with this VC because they have a lot of experience, of course, with the specific structures. So that's something we would definitely recommend.
Yeah, because you have to imagine you go into a marriage almost with your investor. You're probably going to work together for 10 years. And it depends a little bit at what stage they invest in your company, but it's good to know that you are on the same wavelength. So after highlighting all the risk and negative aspects of VC and a few of the positives, and you've done your research and you know which investors you want to target, we wanted to give you a few go-tos and things that all investors like. So all investors like to see a complementary team, a team where you combine, a lot of people use this metaphor, a hacker, a hustler, and a hipster. So a team where you have a hustler who really drives sales, who's really good at linking people with the company, selling the product, a hacker, somebody who's able to build the product, and a hipster, somebody who's able to assess what is the best feel of the company. How do you shape a product? How should a product feel? But those are in-house skills that investors really like to see.
And to add to that, I think many VCs don't really like investing into single founded companies. So that's something to think about as well. A team of 2 or 3 is often preferred. But the next point is decision making. So I would say, generally speaking, VCs really look for people who are able to critically assess their own idea and also challenge the assumptions they are making, and who have a lot of reason for why they're doing certain things, and who are also able to lay out these reasons and develop a strategy, so to say. Even if your strategy might change again in a month or 2, I think working out a strategy and trying to think, what assumptions is this strategy based on? How can I validate these assumptions? What are my reasons for making certain choices, and how can I explain that to an external party so that that party can know that I'm a strong decision maker and I consider and weigh a lot in my decision making, is something that is very beneficial as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, for sure. And what we talked about earlier, traction is a very important thing, and with traction often comes also a form of validation and product market fit and founder market fit. So it's really good sometimes you have a great idea and you just start working on it and you think it's great, but the best is always to see whether you're actually solving a problem in the market, and you do that through finding the product market fit. Is the market interested in your product? And also to ask yourself, am I really the chosen one to solve this problem, or can I get somebody on board who is the chosen one to help me to solve this problem because you ran into a problem as an individual or you saw it happening around you? That's a founder market fit.
Then VCs also look for people who are quick learners and who listen and ask really, really good questions, who are self-critical and able to implement feedback and ask for feedback and adapt and implement things quite quickly. So generally speaking, as a founder, don't be afraid to ask questions, because I think it also really shows that you are willing to learn and that you're coachable, which is something that VCs also look for.
Yeah, and everybody knows, I think anybody who tried anything, or all investors know how hard it is to build a company. So really try to convey in those meetings that you're a nuclear reactor almost, that has a great source of energy and that is able to build this company through hard heads and hands, and has a lot of passion for what they are doing, and by all means necessary is willing to make this company a success, because of course that is also the relationship that you enter, especially in the early stages that we invest in. For example, we almost only care about the team behind the product, because a product can always change, but you need to make sure, can this person hold up through the hardship that will be thrown at you, and the 100 no's you receive when you're trying to sell your company, and the 1 yes. So that's very, very important.
Last but not least, secret tips, which we call secret tips, because I think, VCs have a lot of secrets or things that you wouldn't know if you weren't part of them. For example, VCs love warm introductions, which means they like it if you are introduced to them by someone they know, which doesn't make so much sense. I don't really understand why. But given that it is like that, I think what you should always try to do is try to get a warm introduction to a VC if you want to have access to funding, and be super creative in how you do that. Like, try to get their attention whatever way you can. For example, I don't know, try searching, like, do you have any shared contacts on LinkedIn? If not, how can you build them up to get this warm introduction? And yeah, another thing is I think founders have to be super persistent. With ASIF, we had one founder who got, I think, overall 20 no's, but people still really appreciated and liked that he kept coming back, and he kept trying to see if there was a new angle or a new way in which he could get access to VC funding or ASIF Ventures funding. It's also really important that you know your worth. Like, if you walk into one of these meetings, like, really know what your worth is and what you're trying to build and why it's valuable, and don't let anyone put you down. Also, don't let any no's put you down, because I think generally speaking, some of this evaluation is also quite subjective, and one VC might not like certain things that another one might love. If you do trials or pilots, try to get paid for them, because you're already creating value. Yeah, be critical of don't undersell yourself. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And then there's also a lot of VC etiquette, so certain things that people like to see from founders. For example, if you close a conversation, that you ask, what is it that I have to do next in order to ensure that you would continue to be interested, or something like that.
And with regards to know your worth, like, there will be investors that you will meet for a meeting, and they will just say, yeah, now you pitch the product. But that is really a moment where you can say as an entrepreneur, listen, if this is the basis of our relationship, I don't think this will be viable. Is it okay if this is like a mutually beneficial talk? And because if somebody says, okay, now you can just pitch the product straight off the bat, there's an instant power dynamics being set. But at the end of the day, like, all investors thrive off the innovation of the entrepreneur. So it's really important that you are more important, almost, I would say, to the investors than they are to you, even though it doesn't seem like that always.
And then we've almost come to the end of our session. We'll skip through this in 2 minutes, so we still have 5 minutes for questions, but we basically collected some additional resources. I won't go into it too deeply, but Bart, maybe we can send over the presentation and you can share them with everyone. But yeah, basically different things that we've made use of, either to learn about VC ourselves or things that we've started compiling that might be valuable for you as well. And then we wanted to close off by asking, do any of you have startups, or do you want to have startups in the future? Because there are a few things that ASIF Ventures could do for you if you would like that, which is, you can always apply for funding. So like we said, we fund early stage Amsterdam-based startups. Don't think that there's a too early point to approach us, because if it's too early, then we also have things like our little nurture base of startups who we kind of nurture throughout their developments until the point where we think that maybe they could become an investment opportunity. You can always ask us for advice. On Thursdays, we always have office hours. You can find information about that on our website and on Facebook. I think the office hours for this week aren't up yet, but after this, I will speak to our marketing director about that. We also have a lot of different event formats for aspiring entrepreneurs. So we have pitch nights where you can showcase your startups and win prizes and get feedback from a jury. We're organizing a hackathon in February with a partner organization called Hello Mentor, where we basically want to do something like a startup sprint where you can develop a startup idea in 10 days. We do different webinars, so things where you can learn key knowledge for young founders. We have a common grounds format where we look at how social topics and sustainability topics relate to entrepreneurship. And then we also will be starting a new fuck up nights format where we want to give a space to young founders to learn about how to use failures and fuck ups as something constructive and a learning opportunity. And we also have a lot of resources on our website for young founders. We'll also be developing an online community because we feel like in COVID times that's very important. So stay tuned for that because it's coming soon. And you can also just follow us on social media because I think that's the easiest way to stay in touch. And if you want to find more information about us, you can either email us for any questions you might have. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or add us. I think from our side, it's just very important. If you do ever have questions, our job is basically to, once again, democratize venture capital knowledge, so please approach us.